I went trick-or-treating with my kids on Halloween, and when I came home, I saw my wife in bed with another man in a Superman costume. I'll start from the beginning. I never thought I'd be that guy. You know, the one who thought his life was locked down, everything secure, until it wasn't. My wife, Gina, and I had been married for 10 years, together for almost 15. We had a history, a life built around things that most people would consider mundane. House projects, parent-teacher meetings, weekend brunches. Looking back, I guess it's that sense of routine that made it all so easy to ignore. Halloween night started like every other one for the last few years. It was a big deal in our neighborhood, where parents dressed up just as enthusiastically as the kids. Gina and I used to make it an us thing. She'd go as something glam, and I'd be some goofy sidekick. This year, I was rocking a Superman costume, and Gina was dressed as a sultry vampire with blood-red lipstick and dark curls spilling over her shoulders. She looked incredible, like she'd stepped out of a magazine. I guess I was proud to have her on my arm, even after a decade. The kids had already run ahead, racing from house to house, and I followed close behind, snapping photos for memories. I caught Gina glancing at her phone a few times, but it didn't bother me. Halloween was a chaotic night, and she was probably coordinating with the other parents. But then she started to lag behind, checking her phone a little too often. Just as we rounded a corner near the park, she said she'd forgotten the bowl of candy for the trick-or-treaters we were supposed to leave at our door. "I'll be back in a bit," she promised, flashing me a quick smile before disappearing into the dark. Gina hadn't struck me as the forgetful type. She was organized to the point of obsession. She remembered everything down to our daughter's exact shoe size and where she'd last left her favorite stuffed bunny. But that night, I shrugged it off. After all, it was Halloween, and everyone was a little scatterbrained. I kept trick-or-treating with the kids, calling Gina a few times with no answer. An hour went by, then another. Finally, I decided to take the kids back, figuring she'd somehow gotten roped into something. I remember feeling a nagging unease creeping up my spine, something that told me she wasn't just passing out candy, but I brushed it aside. She was my wife, for God's sake. We had a life together, a family. It was almost 9:30 when we arrived back home. The front door was unlocked, and the lights were dim, a soft glow coming from the hallway leading to our bedroom. I remember thinking how strange it was that the rest of the house was so quiet, with only the faint hum of music floating from the bedroom. I sent the kids upstairs to get ready for bed and followed the sound. In the back of my mind, there was a tiny whisper, a voice telling me that something wasn't right. But I kept walking, feet moving almost on their own. The door to our bedroom was cracked open just a sliver. I pushed it open, expecting to see Gina, maybe getting ready to surprise me with some elaborate Halloween trick. But it wasn't just Gina. There she was, tangled in the sheets with someone else, a stranger, a man I didn't recognize, his face half-shadowed in the dim light. They froze, staring at me like a deer caught in headlights. For a moment, none of us moved, time seeming to stand still. Then, as if on cue, Gina gasped, grabbing at the sheets to cover herself, eyes wide with panic. My heart slammed against my chest. I felt a mixture of rage, disbelief, and humiliation flooding through me. This wasn't some twisted Halloween prank. It was real. She was really there, with him, in our bed. I heard a voice I didn't recognize, mine, ask, "What the hell is going on?" Gina stammered, pulling herself up and wrapping the sheets around her like they'd protect her from the truth that was now burning its way out of my eyes. I thought you'd be out longer," she mumbled, her face pale, voice trembling. I could see the tears forming, but they didn't soften me. Not this time. The man sat up, looking just as shocked as she was, and grabbed his clothes. I should go," he said quickly, not even looking at me as he stumbled out of the room. I didn't even try to stop him. When he was gone, Gina and I just stared at each other. She looked like a stranger to me, someone I couldn't even begin to understand. I opened my mouth, searching for the right words, but everything felt too heavy, too raw. My mind raced, clawing for answers. What did I miss? How did we get here? She spoke first, breaking the silence. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen." Her voice cracked, and I could see the guilt etched into her face. But it wasn't enough to make any of this make sense. Why? I asked, the question barely more than a whisper. She took a shaky breath, looking away. I don't know. Maybe because I needed something. Something I didn't think you could give me. I swallowed, feeling my throat tighten. Every part of me screamed to storm out, to leave her standing there in the mess she'd made. But part of me needed to know the why, the reason she'd thrown our life together into this chaos. So, what happens now? I asked, my voice barely steady. Gina looked down, her face full of regret and something else I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. She whispered, I don't know. It was clear she hadn't thought this through. Whatever she had with that man, it wasn't worth what she just lost. And yet, here we were, the two of us standing in the wreckage of what was once our life. I turned, forcing myself to walk out of that room, out of the place that no longer felt like home. The kids were already asleep, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just torn through their world. I went downstairs and sat on the couch, trying to process what had just happened. I'd gone out tonight as a doting father, dressed in a superhero costume to bring joy to my kids. And now, I was sitting here, my whole life shattered, feeling more like a fool than any hero. And the worst part? Somewhere deep inside, I knew this was just the beginning of the nightmare. That night felt endless. I sat there on the couch, just staring at the wall, replaying every detail of the past few weeks, trying to make sense of it all. Every late night, every glance at her phone, every distant look Gina had given me. It all came flooding back like pieces of a puzzle I had ignored for too long. When Gina finally came downstairs, she looked hesitant, like she was approaching a wounded animal. She opened her mouth, then closed it, unable to meet my eyes. It was strange. In all the years we'd been together, I'd never seen her look so small. I didn't want to make it easy for her. How long? I asked, my voice rough, not from anger but from the sheer exhaustion of everything we had just been through. She hesitated, biting her lip, and then said softly, a few months. It wasn't serious, not at first. She reached out her hand as if to touch my shoulder, but I flinched and she withdrew it, her face falling. I just needed someone to talk to. Talk to? I scoffed, bitterness slipping into my voice. I don't remember us doing much talking upstairs. She looked down, her shoulders slumping. You're right. I didn't handle this right. I should have talked to you, told you what I was feeling. But you've been so busy, and I felt like you didn't even see me anymore. She looked at me with tears brimming in her eyes, but they didn't soften me. Not this time. Busy? The word hit me like a slap. Yes, I'd been busy. I'd been juggling work, taking care of the kids, and trying to keep our lives running smoothly. And here she was, acting like my dedication was a fault, like I'd been neglecting her. She took a deep breath, gathering herself. I know it doesn't make sense, and it sounds pathetic, but I felt invisible. And when I met him, he made me feel seen, like I mattered. Her words echoed in my mind, twisting with a cruel irony. I thought I was the one she saw, the one who mattered. But now, I felt like a stranger in my own life, as if everything I'd built and fought for meant nothing. We sat there in silence, the weight of her confession pressing down like a stone. I should have yelled, should have stormed out and left her to deal with the pieces. But instead, I just sat there, numb and hollow. And maybe that's what scared me the most, how quickly the anger had faded into this deep, unyielding emptiness. Eventually, she spoke again, her voice a broken whisper. What do you want me to do? Do you want me to leave? I looked at her, my mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted her gone, wanted to erase every trace of her betrayal. But another part of me couldn't bear the thought of coming home to an empty house, explaining to our kids why their mother wasn't around anymore. I don't know, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. I don't know what I want. I need time to think. She nodded, and for a moment, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. A hope that maybe I could forgive her, that we could somehow fix this. But I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She stayed on the couch that night, curled up like a child, while I slept, or try to sleep, upstairs in our bed, the bed that no longer felt like ours. Every creak of the floor, every faint sound of the night reminded me of what I'd seen, of the way she'd looked at him. The next few days were a blur. Halloween decorations still dotted the neighborhood, now eerie reminders of that night. Every plastic pumpkin, every fake skeleton grinning from a lawn seemed to mock me, as if they knew my life had turned into some twisted nightmare. Gina tried to talk to me, but I kept my distance. I went through the motions, drove the kids to school, showed up to work, pretended everything was normal. But inside, I was a mess, my mind trapped in an endless cycle of questions and doubts. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, I found myself scrolling through Gina's social media, trying to find something, anything, that would give me answers. It felt invasive, and I hated myself for doing it, but I couldn't stop. I needed to understand how someone I'd known for so long could feel like a complete stranger. That's when I found it. A photo buried deep in her feed, months old, of her at a work event. She was smiling, leaning in just a bit too close to a man with dark hair and an easy smile. The same man who'd bolted from our bedroom. I stared at the photo, feeling a fresh wave of betrayal wash over me. He looked so ordinary, so unremarkable. And yet, he was the one who'd made her feel seen. Suddenly, I realized I couldn't do this alone. The weight of it was too much to carry on my own. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in a while, my best friend, Mark. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, man," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "What's up?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. I need to talk. Are you free?" "Always," he replied without hesitation. "Want to meet somewhere?" An hour later, we were sitting in a dimly lit bar downtown, nursing beers and avoiding the elephant in the room. Mark had always been there for me, through thick and thin. He was the one who'd helped me navigate the early days of marriage, the one who'd been there when our son was born. If there was anyone who could help me make sense of this, it was him. After a few sips, I finally mustered the courage to tell him. "Gina's been seeing someone." Mark's face fell, his eyes widening in shock. "What? Are you serious?" I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. "I caught them. Halloween night. She was with him in our bed." He let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Damn, man. I don't even know what to say. That's brutal." I took a long swig of my beer, the bitterness matching the taste in my mouth. "Yeah, I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to throw her out. But the kids, I don't want them to lose their mom." Mark nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Look, I'm not going to tell you what to do. This is complicated. But I know you. You're a good guy, and you don't deserve this. Just don't make any decisions right now. Give yourself time to think. And remember, whatever happens, you're not alone." His words gave me a strange sense of comfort, a reminder that I wasn't as isolated as I'd felt. We sat in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts, before Mark finally broke the silence. "Just one thing," he said, his voice quiet. "Do you think she really loves this guy?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Did she love him? Or was he just a distraction, a way for her to escape whatever she thought was missing in our life? I realized I had no idea, and that terrified me. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't know if I want to find out." When I got home that night, Gina was waiting for me in the living room, her eyes red and swollen. She'd been crying, maybe for hours. I almost felt sorry for her, but the memory of what she'd done kept me distant, guarded. She looked up as I walked in, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, then nodded, sitting down across from her. She took a shaky breath, staring at her hands. "I know I've hurt you, and I know there's nothing I can say to fix this," she began, her voice trembling. "But I want to try. I want to be honest with you, to tell you everything if you'll let me." Something in her voice sounded different, raw, like she was finally ready to face the truth. And maybe, in that moment, I was ready to hear it. Maybe, just maybe, I could finally start to understand. And as she began to talk, I felt a strange sense of anticipation. A feeling that this conversation was about to lead somewhere I hadn't expected, to a truth that might change everything I thought I knew. Gina took a deep breath, gathering herself before speaking. Her eyes met mine, filled with a mix of fear and resolve. I could tell she was steeling herself for something difficult, and for the first time in days, I was ready to listen. Maybe I was ready to understand, even if I wasn't ready to forgive. "I know there's nothing I can say to excuse what I did," she began, her voice shaking. "But there's more to this than just what happened that night. And I think you deserve to know the whole story." I leaned forward, crossing my arms. Part of me wanted to stop her, to cut her off and tell her that no story could justify what she'd done. But another part of me, the part that still cared, still wanted to believe in the person I thought she was, urged me to hear her out. She swallowed hard, then continued. "I met him, Ethan, last summer. He's a friend of someone at work, and we ran into each other at a work function. It started off innocent, just talking, sharing stories, you know? I didn't know, but I nodded anyway. I didn't mean for it to go anywhere," she said, her gaze dropping to the floor. "At first, it was just nice to talk to someone who saw me. Someone who wasn't busy or stressed or," she trailed off, catching herself before she could say more. I could feel my jaw tighten, my fists clenching involuntarily. So this was my fault? Because I'd been busy and stressed? I wanted to tell her exactly what I thought of her excuses, but I forced myself to stay quiet, to let her finish. Gina seemed to sense my anger, and her eyes softened, guilt flashing across her face. "I know it sounds selfish. I know it was wrong. But the more we talked, the more I felt understood, in a way I hadn't felt in a long time." Her words stung. I thought I knew her, thought I was the one who understood her best. But now, sitting across from her, I realized how far apart we drifted without even noticing. How had I missed it? She took a shaky breath, continuing. "I know it doesn't make sense, but it felt like he filled a part of me I didn't even know was empty. I convinced myself it was harmless, that it would never go beyond just talking. But then it did, and I couldn't stop it." Her confession left me reeling. Here I was, hearing the worst parts of my marriage stripped bare, laid out in the harshest terms. She wasn't just telling me about an affair. She was telling me that there was a part of her that I didn't understand, a part that had driven her into the arms of another man. "Did you love him?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, my voice tight with suppressed emotion. She shook her head immediately, eyes wide. "No, I don't know if that's what you want to hear, but no, it was never about love. It was the distraction, an escape. I know how horrible that sounds, but it's the truth. I've been so unhappy, and I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to make it stop." Her words hung heavy in the air, and I felt something shift inside me, a crack forming in the wall of anger and resentment I'd built up since that night. She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw genuine remorse in her eyes. She wasn't hiding behind excuses or defensiveness anymore. She was laying everything bare, exposing her mistakes and regrets. "I've broken everything, haven't I?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer, because I didn't know what to say. In my mind, everything was broken, shattered beyond repair. But seeing her there, vulnerable and remorseful, made me question everything. If she really didn't love him, if it was all just some desperate attempt to fill a void, maybe there was still something worth saving. "I don't know," I replied finally, my voice rough. "But I know things can't go back to how they were. Not after this." She nodded, accepting my words with a quiet sadness. We sat in silence for a long time, each lost in our own thoughts. I could feel the weight of her confession pressing down on us, the gravity of everything she'd revealed. And yet, there was a strange sense of relief too, a release of all the tension and secrets that had been festering between us. After what felt like an eternity, I looked at her and asked the question that had been gnawing at me since that night. "So, what do you want now?" She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected me to ask. "I want to try to fix this," she said, her voice trembling. "I know it might be impossible, and I know I have no right to ask, but I want to try. I want us to find a way back." Her words stirred something in me, a flicker of hope buried beneath the anger and hurt. Could we really find a way back? Could we rebuild what had been broken? I didn't know. But in that moment, I realized that I wasn't ready to give up either. There was too much history, too much love, too much that still bound us together. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was naive, but I wanted to try. I wanted to believe that we could survive this, that we could come out stronger on the other side. But even as I opened my mouth to tell her that, something stopped me. There was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, a doubt that wouldn't go away, a part of me that still questioned if she told me everything, if there were more secrets she was hiding. So I held back, keeping my answer to myself, and told her instead, I need time. Over the next few weeks, things settled into an uneasy routine. We lived like roommates, exchanging polite conversations and careful glances, both of us walking on eggshells. The kids didn't seem to notice the tension, thankfully. But every night, after they went to bed, the silence between Gina and me was suffocating. One evening, as I was getting ready to turn in, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Frowning, I unlocked my screen and read the text. I'm sorry to contact you like this. My name is Ethan. My blood went cold. Ethan, the man who had ripped my life apart, the man I'd seen with Gina in our bed. And now he was texting me, as if he had the right to say anything to me at all. Another message followed. Please, I just want to talk. It's important. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. But something made me hesitate. I didn't know what he could possibly want to say, but there was a strange part of me that wanted to hear him out, if only to understand what he'd been thinking. Maybe he'd offer some explanation, some insight that would help me understand Gina's betrayal. I texted back, "What do you want?" Within seconds, he replied, "I just want to meet. I know you probably hate me, and I don't blame you. But there's something you should know." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him the next day at a coffee shop downtown. I didn't tell Gina. I wasn't even sure why I was going myself. But curiosity, and maybe a desire for closure, drove me. The next afternoon, I walked into the coffee shop, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. I spotted him immediately, sitting by the window, looking just as ordinary and unremarkable as he had in the photo. There was nothing about him that hinted at the chaos he'd brought into my life. He looked up as I approached, standing up awkwardly. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice quiet. "I know this isn't easy." I sat down, folding my arms. "Just say what you need to say." He nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know you must hate me, and I understand. But you need to know that I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't even know Gina was married when we first started talking." The words took me by surprise. "What do you mean?" He shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his coffee. "She never told me she was married. I only found out later, when I saw a picture of your family in her office. She told me it was complicated, that you two were separated, that you were only together for the kids." I felt my jaw tighten, anger simmering beneath the surface. So, Gina hadn't just betrayed me. She'd lied to him, too, weaving a story that made her actions seem justified, reasonable. "She told me you were an absent father," he continued, his voice tinged with regret. "That you didn't love her, that you barely even noticed her anymore." I believed her. I didn't know the truth until that night, when you walked in. The anger I'd been holding back exploded, my hands clenching into fists. Gina had crafted an entire narrative, twisting our life into something unrecognizable, something that justified her betrayal. And now I didn't know what to believe. What had been real? What had been a lie? Ethan looked at me, his eyes filled with remorse. "I'm sorry, man. If I'd known the truth, I never would have. I never would have gotten involved." I stared at him, the weight of his words settling over me. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to find a way to release the anger boiling inside me. But instead, I just sat there, silent, as the truth unraveled in front of me. In that moment, I realized that I'd only scratched the surface of Gina's betrayal. There were still layers of deception, hidden depths to her lies that I hadn't even begun to uncover. And as I looked into Ethan's remorseful eyes, I felt a chill run through me. Because if Gina had lied to him, if she'd twisted the truth so completely, what else had she been hiding? Ethan's words stayed with me like a haunting melody, one I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. Days turned into weeks, and life began to feel like a routine of just getting by. Gina was still staying with her sister, leaving me to explain her absence to the kids, who were full of questions I had no good answers for. I told them she needed a break, that she was helping Aunt Lori with a project, anything to keep their world from splintering. But even in her absence, Gina was everywhere. In the empty bed I tried to ignore, in the mess of forgotten notes and photos I kept finding around the house. She was there in the things I couldn't throw away and the memories I couldn't escape. Then, one night, as I sat in the living room flipping through an old photo album, my phone buzzed with a message from her. It had been weeks since we'd spoken directly. Her messages had been few and guarded, mostly check-ins about the kids or logistics. But this message was different. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, feeling a familiar knot tighten in my chest. Every part of me wanted to ignore it, to block her number and keep the wall up. But something made me hesitate. Maybe I was just tired of feeling angry, or maybe I needed something, some kind of closure. I finally texted her back, agreeing to meet. The next day, I walked into a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Gina was already there, sitting by the window, nervously twisting her wedding ring, a gesture that struck me as both ironic and painful. She looked different, weary, haunted. She glanced up as I approached, a flicker of relief and fear crossing her face. "Thanks for meeting me," she said softly. I nodded, keeping my expression unreadable. "What did you want to talk about?" She took a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "I know I don't deserve it, but I just need to say a few things, to clear the air. Maybe it's more for me than for you. But I need you to understand." I watched her, waiting, my heart pounding as she gathered her words. "I know I hurt you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I know nothing I say can change what I did. But there's something I need you to understand, something I didn't realize until now." She looked up, meeting my eyes. "I think I've been lying to myself for years, lying about what I wanted, who I was. And I tried to blame it on you, on the kids, on our life. But the truth is, the problem wasn't you. It was me." Her words struck a chord, something deep and painful. It was as if she was peeling back layers I didn't even know existed. I wanted to interrupt, to tell her how selfish she'd been, how unfair it was to put me through this. But I stayed quiet, listening. "When I met Ethan, it wasn't about love," she continued, her voice trembling. "It was about escaping this feeling I couldn't explain, a feeling that something was missing in me. And instead of dealing with it, I ran. I hurt you, hurt our family, for nothing." I clenched my fists, feeling the sting of her confession. She had thrown everything away because she couldn't face her own demons. And somehow, I had been the one left to pick up the pieces. She looked down, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve it. But I needed you to know that it wasn't your fault. You were always there, always the husband and father we needed. I was just too lost to see it." Her words hit me like a wave, washing over me in painful clarity. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about a brokenness in her that I had never truly understood, a brokenness she hadn't even understood herself. And maybe, in some strange way, that gave me the closure I'd been looking for. "What now, Gina?" I asked quietly, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "What do you want?" She hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached for mine. "I don't expect anything, but if there's even a small chance, if you let me try to fix this, I'll do whatever it takes. I'll go to therapy, I'll stay with my sister until you're ready. I'll do anything. I just want a chance to be the person I should have been all along." Her words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. And for the first time since Halloween, I saw a glimpse of the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman who had once been my everything. And I realized something I hadn't expected. I wanted to believe her. A part of me wanted to try, to see if we could rebuild what had been shattered. But I couldn't answer her, not yet. I didn't know if I could ever truly trust her again, if I could ever look at her without remembering the betrayal that had torn our lives apart. And I couldn't bring myself to make promises I wasn't sure I could keep. "I need time, Gina," I said finally, my voice steady but cold. "I can't give you an answer now." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I understand. I'll wait, as long as it takes. I just needed you to know that I'm not giving up. Weeks passed. Gina stayed with her sister, true to her word, and I began to pick up the pieces of our life, slowly rebuilding a routine with the kids. But in the quiet moments, when the kids were asleep and the house was silent, I would find myself thinking of her, wondering if she was really changing, if she was finally facing the parts of herself that had led to this nightmare. I saw glimpses of her in those weeks, a text to check in about the kids, a message of encouragement when she heard about a promotion I got at work. Each message was a reminder of the life we had once shared, of the love we had once promised each other. And slowly, the walls I had built around my heart began to crack, just a little. Then, one evening, I came home to find a letter in the mail. It was from Gina. Dear Michael, I know I've caused you so much pain, and I don't deserve to be a part of your life anymore. But there's something I need you to know before I let go completely. I've started seeing a therapist, trying to understand the reasons behind everything I did, and it's made me realize how much I took for granted. I know I may never earn back your trust, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying, not just for us, but for myself. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm only asking that you remember the person I was before I lost myself, the person who loved you more than anything. And if you ever decide to try again, I'll be waiting. Gina. I held the letter in my hands, feeling a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, but also something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Maybe this was the end of us. Maybe it was too late to salvage anything from the wreckage. But as I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer, I realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't just about her. It was about me, about letting go of the bitterness that had been eating away at me since that night. Whether or not we ever found a way back to each other, I knew I had to find a way to forgive. Not for her, but for myself. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward healing. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.